Okay, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Sabrina Kofer, and on behalf of Choice and LibTech Insights, I'd like to welcome you to today's program, Open Affiliation Metadata, How Recent Innovations Help Libraries and Librarians. Today's session is part of LibTech Insights, or LTI, a library technology content vertical from Choice, which I'll talk about more in a minute. But before we get started, I'd like to point out just a few features of the webinar software. All the attendees who join the presentation are automatically muted and your cameras are off, so don't worry about generating any noise or feedback. We've got that taken care of for you. In the main area of the screen, you can follow along with the presentation materials. To adjust the size of the slides or video, you can use the divider in the middle of the screen to slide the sizes to your liking. We are using the Q&A feature today. Please use it to ask questions of our speakers and to share any comments. We'll answer as many questions as we have time for at the end of the presentation, so please do type your questions into the Q&A module as they occur to you. You can also use the upvote feature to highlight questions you like or would like to be addressed. Also, there's closed captioning available for today's session. To toggle the automated captions on or off, please use the CC button on the bottom panel of your screen. Last, please note that we are recording today's program, and everyone who registered should receive a follow-up email with a link to the recording and today's slides. Okay, so before we jump into the presentation, I'd just like to tell you a little bit about LTI. LibTech Insights is a content vertical from Choice that examines the day-to-day impact of library and education technology on academic librarians. Faculty, researchers, administrators, and students. The channel provides practical guidance on technology trends and products as they relate to productivity, accessibility, discovery, operations, and content management. You can find out more about LTI and sign up for the weekly newsletter via the links in the chat. And I will also put a link for an upcoming webinar on December 10th, which is on building an AI literacy framework. Okay, and that's enough out of me. So with that, I will hand it over to our speakers for today, Kyle and Amanda.
Great. Thank you very much, Sabrina. And thank you, Ashley, as well, both of you for setting this up and everyone who's joining us today. I do want to say quickly at the start, I know that everyone has a lot on their minds over the last couple of days. And what me and Amanda are doing is trying to roll up our sleeves and focus on helping to make the world a better open place. So I did want to lead with that. We're going to talk today about open affiliation metadata. My name is Kyle Demas. I'm the Chief Operating Officer at OpenAlex. And my colleague Amanda, who is going to be presenting a few minutes after me, she's waving now, is going to introduce herself when she gets up as well. To get started here, I wanted to give everyone an idea of the presentation at a glance, sort of the flow of the presentation and what we hope to cover, and remind everyone that there is a Q&A at the end that Sabrina is going to be helping to moderate. So please feel free to put questions in the chat as they come up or in the Q&A box. We'll do welcome and intros, which we're sort of already halfway through. And then we're going to dive right into the problem of open affiliation metadata and the solution. And then we'll talk a little bit about OpenAlex and ROAR, which, spoiler alert, I think are the two solutions, the two parts of the solution. And then we'll talk specifically about our approaches and the importance of both to libraries and librarians, and then end with some calls to action before the Q&A. But first, we've got a couple of poll questions to get to know the audience a bit better. Oh, great, they popped up very quickly and efficiently. Thank you. So the first one is, do you work with scholarly metadata on a daily basis? Yes or no? How familiar are you with ROAR? And this is a scale of not familiar at all to very familiar, and then the same with OpenAlex. So I think we give people about 30 seconds to vote here, and then the results are going to magically pop up on screen because of Sabrina and Ashley's great work. So just another second or two, I think. Okay, great. And I think everyone can see these. I'm not sure, but it looks like this was a close race. It looks like about 50% of people work with scholarly metadata on a daily basis, but more than half. In terms of how familiar are you with ROAR, I think this is really interesting. I see Amanda shaking her head as well. It looks like combined 62% have really very little knowledge of it, and a few are Oh, I love the 5 people who have memorized their institution's ROR ID. But great. Hopefully you're going to learn a lot about ROR, and a lot of these answers will change. And then going down to OpenAlex, also sort of similar results. I see a couple people say they've seen so many of my videos, they know me, which is really great. I see some familiar faces in the attendee list. But that's great. We hope that you're going to learn about all of these as well. And then I think we have one more. Oops. Sorry. There's one more poll solution. Have you looked at your institution's ROR record? And if you have you submitted a curation request? And obviously, for the people who have said that they've never done that, we can expect to see a lot of no's here, but we'll be curious to see this as well. Okay, and here come the answers. Okay, great. 25% have looked at their institution's ROR record, which is, I think, good news for both me and Amanda. But much fewer of you, so 8% have submitted a curation request. So we're going to talk all about this, and hopefully that will change. But this is really good context for us to know. So thank you very much for filling that out. Okay, so the problem and the solution. I always like to start talking about the problem because I think it really helps frame everything that Amanda and I are both doing with our organizations. And the frame I like to use is one of research intelligence. And the idea here is that if we collect data on research activities, we can get some insights or intelligence from that to help make better decisions. And that's everything from doing a systematic review and making sure you're finding the exact right paper when there's almost 10 million publications a year now, to more complex things like who should we collaborate with on topic X, or what are the works that we've funded. The challenge with this entire industry, and this is very different from every other sector, I think in the world, no one's corrected me on this yet, but I look forward to when someone does, is that institutions don't even have an inventory of the work that they do. And most business intelligence, you have at least an inventory of your assets, and then you're able to do all sorts of really cool analytics on that. And the reason why is actually a very important one that's a very critical feature of science. When a researcher publishes a paper, they don't have to get their manager's approval, and their manager and their department administrator is not deciding what's published. In fact, the global research community through peer review is deciding. And that is a really important feature of science. But the problem is there's no dotted line back where when something is published, institutions are getting all of that information. And then even if they were able to, they're not getting that for their peer institutions and the global system. Scientific knowledge graphs help provide this data. If you've never heard that term before, you've certainly heard of things like Web of Science, Scopus, Dimensions, OpenAlex. Some of you had heard of, some of you hadn't. But the idea here is we're going through works or publications, like this one here is one of mine, and we're trying to extract information about that to get the title, when it was published, where it was published, by who, what institutions they're at, what is the topic of the publication, who funded it, all of this information. And you can see here we try and extract that. And this is the underlying data that's required for all types of research intelligence. So I'm just going to skip here. But the general logic here, the framework for all of this is you can create a logic layer or a query. Some people are used to hearing the word. And then you can query these knowledge graphs to get the exact results that you're interested in. And then you can do more analyses. But you can only do your filtering and your analyses on the fields that are in these graphs. And so the really important one we're talking about today is the institution that wrote it. So being able to filter by Simon Fraser University, or create a query that's all of the kelp research, but then group by all of the institutions to figure out which institutions are doing that. And this is the challenge that Amanda and I are tackling together in our organizations as well. There's 2 parts to this, and we're going to talk about each of these parts. The first is having a persistent identifier for institutions. Amanda's going to talk a lot about persistent identifiers if you haven't heard of those before. The way that I look at it is having a source of truth for an institution and a unique identifier for that we can then match works to. And then the second part of the problem is doing that matching of the information we get from works to that institution. And we went back and forth a few times on what order we should present this in, but we ended with, I'm going to talk about the matching and then all the cool things you can do because of that matching. And then Amanda's going to talk about how this persistent identifier, or ROR, enables all of the things that we do there. But just to give you a sense of what that problem looks like, I know some librarians are intimately familiar with affiliation text data and affiliation strings. But when we go to publications, we get text, and here's 3 examples from works from the University of British Columbia. And we have to figure out that this text represents the university that we're looking at. And some of these have all sorts of additional information like emails and phone numbers. Some of them, like the one in the middle, has University of British Columbia, but the wrong city. So all sorts of things can happen here. And we need to be able to match that to a source of truth. And this is the ROR record for University of British Columbia. So that's what we're going to be talking about today. I'm first going to go to OpenAlex and talk about that matching component and what that matching component lets libraries do. And then Amanda's going to follow that and talk about ROR specifically. So yes, OpenAlex, our importance to libraries. Really diverse use cases by libraries around the world. I wanted to show a few that are particularly relevant to most institutions, and also ones that leverage sort of the institutional data. But the first thing I want to say about OpenAlex, I'm not going to spend too much time on who we are and what we do, other than to say we're a completely open knowledge graph. So many of you are in libraries and you're familiar with having to license some of these databases and then troubleshoot access. We're completely open. And when I say completely open, I don't just mean you can go to the website for free. I mean, you can download 100% of our source data for free. Anyone around the world can do that. It's a very large database. So just know that you need some skills to be able to do that, but it's all out there. And so is our source code. So everything that we've done to manipulate the data to get to this usable tool is all completely open under either a CC0 or an MIT license, so that you can do whatever you want with it. And that's a major feature. That's our big differentiator. But a couple examples of ways that libraries are using it I wanted to show. The first one, this is always the one that I talk about because it's the simplest use case, but also the most powerful. What research have we published? So just to show you an example, you can go to openalex.org and you can type in your institution's name and click it, and it's going to give you a list of all of the works. You can add all sorts of analyses over here on the right. So you can see I wanted to know the total number of works, how that's changing over time, what countries they've published with, what journals they're publishing in, the fields and topics, who the authors are, what the UN Sustainable Goal contributions are, just as an example of the type of reporting you can do. I put a QR code here just to sort of reaffirm that everything in OpenAlex is completely open, and anyone here is able to use that QR code to get this exact analysis. The university I chose, if you're curious, University of South Florida is my alma mater. So I often go to the institutions that I know pretty well to be able to do some of that. But this is the sort of underlying use case that most people need to be able to do. What are our works? From the user interface, you can download, there's 83,000 results. You could download all of them as a CSV right there. You can also, of course, use APIs and things like that. But you can dive into these analysis and say, oh, we collaborate a lot with China, for instance. If you click on China, it will let you know more about the collaborations with China. So all of that is possible because we have this filter for the University of South Florida. Another really common one that we get from libraries that's worth knowing about is how well are we progressing towards our open access goals? So here is an example. I chose institution country Canada. You could also zoom in on a particular university. So I could have said University of South Florida, show me their open access trends over time. But I also did this to highlight another really cool feature about ROR that I like, is that they have geo tagged information about the institutions. So we can say, I don't want to list every single institution in Canada. There's 97 universities and many other types of institutions. I just want every single institution where there is a Canadian sort of geotag, and then show how open access is changing over time. So that's another example a lot of libraries are doing. As open access becomes more important and people invest in policies and programs, they want to be able to see how well they're working. Another really common one in libraries that doesn't necessarily leverage the institutional information, but it could, is recommending journals. So faculty member is looking for a particular journal in a specific field and they want only a diamond or a gold journal that's in DOAJ or another important index like the CWTS core sources, you're able to find those journals this way. You could also, of course, say, just show me the ones that match this field that my researchers at my institution are looking at. I think I've got a couple more examples, and then I'll be turning it over to Amanda. If you haven't seen VOS Viewer before, this graph on the right is an example of the type of analytics and visualizations that a lot of libraries are doing with VOS Viewer. VOS Viewer is an open source tool. A lot of institutions use it. They'll download data from whether they have a subscription to Web of Science or Scopus or Dimensions, and then they'll import it to VOS Viewer. Well, because VOS Viewer is open and we're completely open as well, they've built an integration so where you can go to OpenAlex, I showed some screenshots from it, and you can literally build your query in there and then copy and paste the URL into VOS Viewer, and it will get all of the works to analyze. And just as an example, showing off the institutional components that we get from ROAR, I said, show me all the University of Windsor publications and give me a network diagram of the other institutions they collaborate with. And sort of you can see it color coded by how impactful in terms of citations those collaborations are. So a lot of really cool things here. I did put at the bottom, you can look at this later, as a YouTube tutorial on specifically how to use VOS Viewer with OpenAlex data. But all of this is completely open. Two more examples. One I know is on the mind of a lot of librarians right now is estimating APC spends. This is something you can do in OpenAlex because we have institutional disambiguated data. So as an example here, I put, show me where the corresponding institution is Simon Fraser University, and the work is either an article or a review, so not things like data sets, and the source is a journal. So basically show me all the journal articles where Simon Fraser University authors are the corresponding authors, and then sum the APC. And then you can see I've also grouped by which sources this is happening in. If you're interested more specifically in how to do that and some of the caveats of these type of analyses, I did put a link here in the bottom that you're going to be able to follow later, but did want to make sure to say that. And then the last use case that is really common for a lot of librarians is citation tracking. So we'll have a publication and we'll know which works cite it and which works were cited by it. And you can do this at the level of one paper, which can be really interesting, but you can also, because of our integration with ROAR, do this at the scale of your entire university. And the interesting things that you get from that are, okay, what are all of the faculty members at our university citing? Which journals are they citing when they're publishing their papers? And how well does that align with our collection strategy? Are there journals that people are citing that we aren't subscribing to, for instance? Are there some that we're subscribing to that we're not being used by our faculty? And how does that vary by departments? You can do all of that. It's a little more complex because it's large, but if you are interested, we've developed an open Python code to facilitate that analysis. So I'm happy to share that afterwards. That's all I wanted to say about OpenAlex. I am going to pass the floor over to Amanda and just, over to you, Amanda.
Thanks, Kyle, for, as always, a fantastic presentation. I'm Dr. Amanda French, and I am the Technical Community Manager for ROAR, the Research Organization Registry, which is an initiative jointly operated by Crossref, DataCite, and the California Digital Library. And I'm going to explain what ROAR is exactly, and again, why it's important for librarians to know about. So ROAR, the Research Organization Registry, as you can see here, is a global community-led registry of open persistent identifiers for research organizations. It's becoming a global standard. It's becoming a default. It's becoming sort of an underpinning architecture of scholarly communication. Now, as you probably all know, that a persistent identifier is a digital identifier that is globally unique, machine resolvable, and persistent. And persistent meaning as permanent as human beings can make it. Importantly, a true persistent identifier also has rich associated metadata that can be retrieved using only the identifier. ROAR makes information about research organizations clean, consistent, normalized, and easy to exchange among software systems so that journal articles, data sets, and other research outputs can be reliably associated with organizations such as universities, laboratories, research institutes, companies, and funders. Even if you haven't heard of ROR or aren't very familiar with it, I'm sure you've heard of ORCID identifiers and digital object identifiers, or DOIs. And of course, both DOIs and ORCID IDs are also persistent identifiers. An ORCID ID identifies a researcher. A DOI identifies a research output, such as a journal article or a data set. And a ROR ID identifies an organization associated with the research, such as, very commonly, the organization where the researcher is employed, also known as the researcher's affiliation. ROR was developed over 3 years of working groups and stakeholder consultations between 2016 and 2019, and the minimum viable registry for ROR was launched in 2019. In the past 2 years especially, we've seen very wide adoption of ROR, including by newer systems such as OpenAlex. ROR is the only open research organization identifier that is free, open, and community-led. Here's a sample ROR record for Virginia Tech, where I actually used to work. And Virginia Tech's official name is Virginia Polytechnic Institute and State University. But of course, very few people call it that. This record should make it clear that ROR IDs, like DOIs and like ORCIDs, aren't just identifiers. The true value of these IDs is that they are associated with rich metadata about the entities that they identify. On this record, you can see the unique ROR ID at the top, on the left there, a name for the organization, Virginia Tech in this case, organization types, and other names this organization goes by. Those other names include acronyms, common alternative names, such as Virginia Tech and Virginia Polytechnic and State University, and commonly used names for the organization in various languages. And that multilingual feature is particularly important for multilingual countries such as Canada and Switzerland and many other countries as well. Additional information shown here includes the organization's website, its location, which does include latitude and longitude, even if behind that GeoNames ID, and its mapping to other identifiers, including ISNI, funder IDs, and Wikidata IDs. ROR also supports parent-child relationships and sibling relationships for organizations, and you can see that here as well. This includes labs, hospitals, research centers, research institutes, each with its own ROR ID. Note as well, in the bottom left there in quite small type, you can see the record's last modified date, as well as links to see the underlying metadata and to request a change to the record. And we'll be talking quite a bit about requesting changes to ROR records later on. The ROR registry currently includes over 110,000 research organizations from around the world, with new records continually being added and existing records continually being updated. This image is taken from our open web UI, our browser search, but all the information shown here, plus a little bit of additional information, is also available as JSON in the ROR API and as both JSON and CSV in the downloadable dataset of ROR. Both the ROR API and the downloadable dataset are entirely open, CC0, and free to use. Since this is an audience of librarians, I thought you might enjoy a quick glimpse at the underlying metadata in JSON for that record that I just showed you. And this does include a few elements not displayed in the web search, such as the ROR schema version that applied when the record was created, the year the organization was established, and the organization's Wikipedia page. You can also see the relationships here and how those work in ROR. Those are simply relationships expressed right within the metadata. Now here's an elegant example of a ROR integration in the data repository Dryad. On this slide, believe it or not, you're seeing ROR in action, even though you can't actually see a ROR ID anywhere on the slide. Dryad was the first ROR adopter and has been using ROR for several years now. And they've been improving their integration as well for the past few years. And Dryad uses ROR behind the scenes to power organization lookups. Sometimes these are called type aheads. You can call them just lookups, suggestions, anything like that, in the form that researchers use when they're depositing a data set to Dryad. This means that a researcher can type the alternate name Caltech and then choose the ROR record for the California Institute of Technology as their affiliation. And similarly, when asked to identify their funder, they can type the acronym CASGC in the funder field and then choose the California Space Grant Consortium. This results in nice, clean, normalized metadata within Dryad, and Dryad then passes that to DataCite in DOI metadata. And so it's important to note here that ROR is infrastructure for infrastructure, meaning that ROR is meant to be used behind the scenes in scholarly systems. Most of the time, individual researchers should really never need to know about ROR, and in that respect, ROR is quite different from both the ORCID ID and the DOI. So you might be wondering why ROR is free. And the answer to that is that ROR, which ironically is not itself an organization, but an initiative, is governed and financially supported by 3 key scholarly infrastructure organizations: Crossref, which actually employs me, DataCite, and the California Digital Library, all of which helped create ROR as a public benefit to scholarship. ROR is committed to following the principles of open scholarly infrastructure, which means that we can't be transferred to a commercial entity, or at least not without open sourcing everything we have that is already open source. So I'm moving on now from what is ROR, and happy to take any questions that you have about that, to why is ROR important for librarians. So I thought the best way to start was with words from a librarian, explaining why it's important for librarians at Caltech. This is a direct quotation from Tom Morell, Research Data Specialist at Caltech Libraries, who explains here why it's important to Caltech librarians to have ROR in their 3 institutional repositories. They have an ETD repository, they have an institutional repository, and they have a data repository. And they were quite an early adopter of ROR, and they integrated ROR into all 3 of those, thanks to Tom. Tom was also heavily involved with integrating ROR into a system, an open source system called Invenio RDM, which is the open source software that runs the very popular generalist repository Zenodo. So no matter what your role is in the library, you probably use a system that either is already using ROR or could be using ROR. If you work in tracking research impact or collecting research intelligence or analyzing research at a large scale, as Kyle was just presenting about, you might well use one of these systems, and all of these systems use ROR. Special shout out to Web of Science, which has added ROR identifiers this fall and has launched that feature today. Literally got an email 90 minutes ago saying, hey, the feature is live in Web of Science. So if you haven't seen ROR in Web of Science, go take a look because it should be there now. If you'd like to see their presentation on their ROR integration, you can see the slides and recording for that from ROR's last community call in September. And I can share that in the chat, and then perhaps one of the facilitators can pass that along. You might also notice some systems that you use for research intelligence missing here. So for instance, perhaps something like Scopus. And if you're becoming convinced that ROR would be useful for you, and in fact for everybody in the scholarly communication ecosystem, you might want to contact them to ask about their plans for integrating ROR. So similarly, if you're a ScholComm librarian, you should know that ROR is the preferred organization identifier for some very key core infrastructure services, including Crossref, DataCite, ORCID, and Sherpa Services, which we used to call Sherpa Romeo, which just in the past week, I think, has rebranded to JISC Open Policy Finder. If you're a data librarian or an institutional repository librarian, you should know that ROR is integrated into most of the most common repository systems. And most of this integration has happened within the last, again, year or 2. Dryad was a very early adopter, so they've been using it for quite a while. And that the very widely used DMP tool, which helps researchers create data management plans, also uses ROR. We recently did a webinar in conjunction with Science about ROR in DSpace 8. So if you're interested in that, I will share a link where you can see the slides and recording from that event. And again, I think perhaps our kindly facilitators can pass that on to you. And then too, we've seen a lot of libraries stand up publishing programs, and ROR is also fairly heavily integrated into publishing systems that libraries might use. So for instance, Open Journal Systems has ROR variously integrated depending on which version you're using. So if you're using 3.3 or above, there's a ROR plugin. And then there's ROR behind the scenes a lot, tracking subscriber statistics to OJS journals, which is kind of nice. And then in OJS 3.5, which is coming either late this year or sometime next year, ROR is going to be natively built in to manage author affiliations in the same way that Dryad does. So that's going to be a really big feature for OJS 3.5. So in short, to sum up, there are many uses for ROR and many essential library systems that use ROR. So with that, I'm going to hand it back to Kyle for just a few minutes to start our section on what you can do to improve open affiliation metadata. Kyle?
Awesome. Thank you, Amanda. Okay, so the first thing I wanted to say is at the beginning, we talked about taking this really messy text and then matching it to a sort of curated record like ROR. And even when ROR is perfect, there are still some challenges with that matching because it's done algorithmically. Algorithms aren't perfect. And so we want to talk about how you can help with this. And the reasons you might want to help are if you're doing any sort of research analytics or you're interested in things like the rankings that are doing this, this is a reason why you might want to help. Just to show here a sort of illustration of the types of problems we get, you can see institution A in blue and institution B in silver or gray. And then underneath that are all these works. So you can see there's data sets, publications, reports, all sorts of things. And the boxes around them are meant to represent that we identified these as being at that institution. So you'll see there's 3 stars on here, and these are the types of errors we make. The first one, institution A, you can see this data set is gold or is gray, and it should have been institution B. So that's an error where we matched it to institution A incorrectly. So we call that a precision match or a precision error. It's also a recall error for institution B because it should have been over to B and we didn't recall it effectively. And that's the same with the blue publication in institution B. And then there's ones where we get a string and we can't match it at all. We don't know what to do with it. It doesn't get matched to any institution, and that's a recall error. We don't want to spend too much of the time going into the weeds of this exact like algorithmic matching because it's a small subset of librarians that really focus on that, and most of them would want quite a bit more than we could give in this time anyways. But I did want to say, if that is what you're interested in, there's a tool that was developed by the French government that is an open source tool. We absolutely love it. That allows you to go in and see how OpenAlex is matching affiliation text to ROR IDs, and then you can make suggestions to improve it. Just to show you as an example here, I typed in Concordia University, and then you can see at the very beginning, we've got this raw affiliation string that we couldn't match to any ROR. And the reason why, if you're in Canada and you're like, why couldn't you tell that was Concordia University? You can see that below, where the next institution is Concordia University of Edmonton, and that's actually different from Concordia University, and there's 5 different Concordia universities. So when it's just Concordia University, it's not confident and it says, somebody please help. So this is where you can go in and sort of make some of those changes. But more importantly, what you can do, we want to talk about today, is help curate your ROR profiles. And I'm just going to show you an example of how that impacts things in OpenAlex and why you would want to do it. And then Amanda's going to talk specifically about how you can do it. So a great example that I like is GLIER, which is the Great Lakes Institute for Environmental Research, if I get that right. It's part of the University of Windsor. It's really famous in my field of ecology of being like really great high impact publications. Every publication from GLIER should be attributed to the University of Windsor. The challenge is that it is so well known as a brand, there are a lot of publications that don't even say the University of Windsor on it. They just say GLIER or Great Lakes Institute of Environmental Research. So when we first started doing this, we realized, and you can see I've done a search in OpenAlex for GLIER in the raw affiliation string, and only 1,300 of the almost 2,200 works were attributed to University of Windsor. And that's because Windsor wasn't anywhere in the affiliation string, and they hadn't yet created it as a sub-affiliation in ROR. So this is an example where when you go to ROR, you add GLIER, has a direct impact. And some of these are really highly cited. This is a really fantastic research institute that does high impact work. And this is the kind of thing that it came to us because they were looking at the CWTS rankings and they said, hey, wait a minute, why aren't these works in there? Well, let's take a look at the ROR profile and have that. So that's why you would want to curate it. And now, Amanda, I'll turn it over to you to finish with how you can curate those things.
Yes, absolutely. I just wanted to follow up with a couple of things. First of all, if you are interested in these strategies for matching messy text strings to ROR IDs, we actually have a blog series about that. We have ROR staff who are very, very well versed in that, who are collaborating with OpenAlex and with other experts in this machine learning technique of matching these text strings to ROR IDs. So just go to roar.org/blog to see the latest in that series about matching if you are interested in that. And then two, I wanted to reiterate Kyle's point that improving ROR metadata as far upstream as possible, including in ROR, improves organization metadata in all of the systems that use ROR, including OpenAlex. So that is why we try to make it very easy to improve the metadata in ROR. So you can see here, here's another screenshot of our web search at roar.org/search. And here's the record for Texas Tech. Every single record that you find in that web search includes a link to the ROR curation form where you can request changes to a record or request a new record. That's just a Google form. It just goes to that URL, curationrequest.roar.org, and we ask for information about the organization. You can just fill that out and submit it. What happens then? Well, once you've made that request, our curators review it. Most requests are quickly approved, and then they go live in ROR within 2 to 4 weeks. More difficult requests might take longer or might need to be referred to members of our International Curation Advisory Board, and not all requests are approved, although most of them are. Occasionally, organizations are out of scope for ROR, or information can't be verified. And then the other thing I wanted to mention is that we sometimes hear that people are reluctant to request changes to ROR until they've sort of consulted everyone at their organization, until they've got approval from their boss and their boss's boss and their boss's boss's boss. But we would encourage you instead to just go ahead and submit these requests for changes, submit them early, submit them often. We can always change records back. ROR is continually being curated. And we especially appreciate the addition of name variants because that really does help with this disambiguation project. And then we also really appreciate, as Kyle was mentioning, these relationships. What are child organizations? What are laterally related organizations? Making sure that those relationships in ROR are accurate is really crucial. And then note too that we have quite precise and nuanced criteria for whether an entity, including a sub-organization like GLIAR, is in scope for ROR. And those are too long to go into here because there are lots of edge cases and lots of little flowchart type things. But the quick and dirty way to determine whether something is in scope for ROR is whether it is used as an independent affiliation in existing published research, like GLIAR. Kyle said a lot of the researchers at GLIAR will say, hey, what's your affiliation? GLIAR. They forget the University of Windsor. So for instance, a researcher might give their affiliation to a publisher or to a repository as the Virginia Tech Transportation Institute, which is a research institute at Virginia Tech, and therefore VTTI is in scope for ROR. Again, I'm not on the curation team. These things do have multiple ramifications, but that's the easiest way to think about it. And then just finally to mention too that in the interests of ease and openness and efficiency and transparency, all curation requests for changes and additions to ROR are open and can be tracked on GitHub. When you submit a request, you get a link to your issue so that you can follow along, see any discussion that might be happening about the issue. And of course, we'll contact you if we need clarification. And then you can see when your request has been approved or denied, and then it would go live in the next published release of ROR, which, as I mentioned, usually happens at least once a month and most often twice a month. So the main takeaway you should have is that improving your organization's ROR record helps improve affiliation metadata in OpenAlex, for sure, but in fact, throughout the entire scholarly ecosystem. And that's really a benefit for everybody. Just a few other sort of calls to action. Looking at your ROR ID, submitting a curation request for your ROR ID is one of the easiest things you can do, but there are other, maybe slightly more difficult things that you can do as well. So if you are involved in DOI registration at your organization, you can use ROR IDs and DOI metadata. There are definitely some librarians who are simply adding ROR IDs to XML that they generate themselves. So that's certainly something you can do. You don't have to integrate ROR into a system. You can simply put it in XML. If you are in charge of an open source system, You can integrate either the API or just the ROR dataset into your open source system. You can choose products that use ROR, like OpenAlex and now like Web of Science. You can upgrade existing systems that you're using to versions that use ROR. I used to run a DSpace repository. I understand that upgrading DSpace is no small effort, but it is something that can help with just improved metadata throughout the entire scholarly ecosystem. You can ask your partners, vendors, and publishers to use ROR. If you're writing research policies, you can mention ROR in those. And if you're negotiating contracts, maybe perhaps especially transformative agreements, you can consider stipulating ROR use in your publishing agreements. We have seen quite a large, this has been an important use case for ROR, is that publishers and librarians both using ROR to help manage these transformative agreements. And then finally, if you have any system that does have a lot of these messy legacy affiliation text strings, you might consider undertaking a project to match them to ROR IDs. It's one thing to use a system that's integrated with ROR and you have ROR going forward, but if you have a lot of these messy text strings, we do have tools to help you match those to ROR IDs. We have a ROR reconciler for OpenRefine that many people like to use, very granular, lots of control over what you're matching using that tool. We have open source Python scripts. We even have, most importantly, an entire parameter of the ROR API that is dedicated to matching text strings to ROR IDs. So you can get in touch with us at support@ror.org with any questions. We'll be happy to help. A lot of this is documented in our documentation as well, so you can get to that from ror.org. And we'd also love to have you come to ROR events, receive ROR announcements, and generally get involved with ROR. So visit ror.org/community to learn more about that. So it is now time, just about time for the Q&A period. But before we do that, we're just going to run this poll again to ask whether during this webinar you have in fact looked at your institution's ROR record. It's one of the first things that people do, and we encourage that. People do love to look up their own ROR ID, and I'm just curious whether anybody has clicked that link to begin at least the process of submitting a curation request.
And I wrote down that the first time we asked, it was 25% for the first one and 8% for the second one.
Thanks.
So I guess we'll see if that moved.
Yep. Yes,
all right.
50% have at least looked. Yeah, the actual submitting a request does take a bit longer. I did want to mention too, I think I mentioned this, but if you do have a large number of batch requests, again, just write us at support@ror.org and we can help you with that, because you probably don't want to submit 12 Google Forms if you don't have to. So we can help you submit batch requests. Well, great.
Yeah, thank you very much. And I think now we can move to the questions and answers. And it looks like there's quite a few of those, which is great. I think Sabrina, you'll be moderating. Is that right?
Yes, yep. Great. Okay. Yeah, thanks so much to Amanda and Kyle. We will jump right into questions. For our attendees, if you haven't submitted a question yet, highly recommend you do so now. And you can also use the upvote feature to highlight, give a thumbs up to questions you like. I'll mostly be using that upvote feature to choose the questions, so please use it. Okay, so looks like our top question here comes from Karen, who asks, does OpenAlex's data include child organizations in an institution's analysis? So I think Kyle will start with you.
Yeah, good question, Karen. So we have two different ways that you can look at an institutional affiliation. You can look at what we call the institutional lineage, or you can look at just the affiliation. The default is to look at the lineage. So if I pull the University of South Florida, at the same time, it's going to pull every other affiliation under it, so that you are able to find all the ones that they might have included some center, but not University of South Florida. It does include those. It does not roll all the way up to super systems. So this is something we changed in the last few months. So if you're the University of California system, it's not that every single thing will roll up to that, because when we do that, all analytics show that the University of California system is the top institution just because they're so large. But it does roll up to the level of an institution. Really good question.
Great. Okay. And it looks like we have another question about affiliations. And Kyle, I think this again came in during your presentation from Tim. How are multiple affiliations, double, but also 3, 4, or more on the byline handled? And another question, how are present/current address affiliations, author moved to a new institution, for example, handled, if at all?
Yeah, and there's probably some parts of this that I can answer, and Amanda might have some as well on how they handle campuses at Roar. The way it works in OpenAlex, when we get a publication, we have an author on that publication, and then that author has their affiliations. Sometimes there's only one, sometimes there are many, like you're suggesting. And what we try and do is parse each of those separately to say this is one string, this is one string, this is one string, and then try and match each of those to their own institution. So that's how that generally works. An author can have multiple affiliations on their publication. And then when they go to do those analyses, if you pull an analysis by that author, you'll find every single work they've ever written throughout their career, every time they've moved. If you pull publications analysis for an institution, you only get the publications where that institution is an author's affiliation. So if I move from the University of British Columbia to Simon Fraser University, which is true, if you pulled an analysis of SFU, you're only going to find my works at SFU, not the ones at UBC. The longer answer is you can, of course, pull a whole massive group of authors that represent a university. Here's my 15,000 faculty members. Show me all of their publications, and then you'll get all of them. And then you can toggle back and forth between your university. So flexibility there.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, specifically to the point of how do you handle when an author moves to a new institution, the way we see this handled mostly in, for instance, Crossref DOI metadata is that the affiliation is in a sense tied to the publication. So if I was at Virginia Tech and I published an article at that point, I would, that article in the metadata, you see this in like publisher landing sites, right? They'll say, hey, list the affiliations. It will list the place where that author was when they published the article, right? And so then if you move to a new institution, that publisher isn't going to update that affiliation. We do think of these as points in time. And that's, again, on an ORCID profile, sure. They could say, I was here, now I'm here. And so ORCID needs to manage that. But usually when we're talking about affiliations, they're a bit more tied to that point of time when that publication was released. If that makes sense.
Yeah, and just like ORCID, we will have for an author a list of every affiliation they've used, but that's a separate analysis than the publications.
I'll also mention too that I happen to be on a working group with COPE, the Committee on Publication Ethics, which is looking at author affiliations because of various ways that people sort of game that system of where they're affiliated to do things with APCs or even things with credit that they don't deserve and all of that kind of thing. So there's a paper coming out from that committee pretty soon that should at least make, guidelines for this kind of thing.
Okay, great. Okay, looks like we have another question about affiliations from Andrew. Say my faculty keep using unit affiliations such as law school name, pharmacy school name, instead of our actual institution name. Do I need to submit new ROR records for each of these units to add as children to the institution, or would they go under other names?
So
Amanda, do you want to start?
I will start. The answer is it depends. But I have to say, in general, schools of that kind are out of scope for ROR. It depends. But yeah, in general, those unit affiliations such as law schools, pharmacy schools are out of scope for ROR. So they wouldn't be all, I mean, the law school of UVA is not an alternate name for UVA. It's a subunit of UVA, but it's not generally considered an independent entity, right? So in general for schools, those will not be in ROR.
And maybe
the way that we think of those in the United States and Canada. We've done, you'd be surprised at how much this varies on a global basis. Like there are faculties in some European and South American organizations that really have quite a different status from that. But yeah.
And I'll add a little bit on how this plays out in a knowledge graph. If you have School of Medicine at UBC, and they have UBC, it goes to UBC. There's no reason to create School of Medicine. And often it becomes problematic because people will see that there's an entity called School of Medicine and they think, oh, well, that's going to give me all the works from the School of Medicine. And that's absolutely not true. Not every publication lets you put that level of metadata on there. So there's some confusion there. But where I will say it's very important is if the entity has a specific different name and it's often used alone. So that example I said of Glyer is really important. And sometimes with schools, they'll do something like UBC doesn't have many schools, it has departments, but they have one entity called the Vancouver School of Economics, and they publish independently and never use UBC. So that is really important. And so I'd say when you're looking at these, don't go through and try and add all of them. But if there's ones that have weird names and people use them a lot, that's where I think you really want to make sure you get.
And as I said, we do try, our curators try to determine whether that entity has a degree of independence from its parent organization before we give it a roar. But you can make your case to us. And the thing is too that many systems, there are things you need persistent identifiers for, and then there are things you can just use as text strings. So probably ideally, a system where somebody is entering in a form like that, like the one I showed in Dryad, you would enter UBC, and then you can have as many text fields as you want that are listing those other affiliations, and it just may not be quite as clean data, but at least that top level, that most important, or I shouldn't say the top, but the highest levels, those major research institutes, those major labs, those hospitals and things like that that do a lot of research will be nice, clean data. And then the rest of it can be improved later.
Okay, got it. Okay, another question we'll do from Cassandra. We talked about this a little bit, but how does ROR handle multiple locations? We have multiple campuses in very different locations, and often our organization is broken apart in systems like Scopus because our researchers often put in their campus when doing affiliations.
Yeah, so Cassandra, I would encourage you to look up your organization in ROR to see how it's currently handled. It depends a lot on the thing. In general, separate campuses each have a ROR ID that are connected together in a relationship. So here's the parent organization, and it has these satellite campuses or whatever, each of which has their own ROR ID. So that's a little bit different from multiple locations. So a very small number of organizations can have multiple locations, but separate campuses are generally in ROR considered separate entities, each of which has one location, right? And then they're connected through the relationships metadata in ROR, usually.
Okay, great. Let's see, another question here from Alicia. I think this is for you, Kyle. What is the difference between APCs paid estimated and some APCs list estimated in APC sums?
Yes, good question. Okay, so when I pulled up that APC sum account, there were two different lists. One was, and they're both estimates. I do want to be really clear about that as well. And thank you for Sabrina for reiterating that. APC paid estimate means we believe that an APC fee was paid for this work. For instance, it's open access in a hybrid journal, or it's open access in a journal that has APC fees. It's safe to assume that an APC was paid under some circumstances, and we say that's the estimate of what the pay was. List, on the other hand, doesn't necessarily mean that an APC was paid. So if there's a closed access work that you could pay to make that open, that's where sort of that list price is coming from. And actually, I'll put in the chat a link to more information on this that walks through, because it also talks about the assumptions of that. I think I put that in this box. Give me just a second. But yeah, I'll put that in there so you can read more about it. But I hope that answers the question. The list price should always be higher than the paid price when you do analysis like that, because things that haven't had an APC paid will still have a list price for it.
Okay. Great.
Dear.
Okay. Let's see, we can move on to another question here. Let's see, it looks like we have a question here from Caitlin. Can we see who updated / added our institution to ROR? If someone else in the organization is taking care of it, it would be good to know who it is.
Yeah, so, and I see thanks for that, Caitlin. And there's actually a similar question further down from Arjun Sabharwal, so I'll answer both of those questions at the same time. Arjun asked, the ROR record does not show who manages the ROR profile at the university. How do I find that out? So we don't have that concept in ROR. Any ROR record can be, anyone can make a request for a change to any ROR record. You don't even have to be affiliated with that organization. Now, in practice, that often happens. So we don't have accounts. We don't have particular people who are assigned for managing particular ROR records. Anyone can make a curation request for any ROR record. Now, the reason why this works, this is different from something like Wikipedia, is that we do have these central curators. We have a small team of central curators. We've had a very small number of cases where two different people from the same organization are both making requests. And because our curators know all of these requests that people are making, they put them in touch with each other. So they say, hey, so-and-so has made this. And so far, we've never had any like edit wars in ROR. We haven't really had any, so-and-so says this and so says something else. So we review, the reason why we can take requests from anyone is that it's all open data. It's the organization's website. Nobody's gonna we verify what that is, and we say, okay, yeah, this is the organization's website. So all of the organization information that we have, what city is it in? I mean, are people, the place where people do tend to have disagreements about what is in ROR do tend to be like, what is the exact name and what are the exact relationships of that internal hierarchy of ROR. So no, Caitlin, you cannot see who updated or added your institution to ROR. You can see the date it was created. But if you make a request and someone else from your organization is also making a request, we will manage that and put you in touch with each other.
Okay, great. Thank you. Okay, we've about 4 minutes left here. Maybe let's do this question from Virginia. What happens if your institution changes its status? For example, in our case, we changed from a college to a university. Do we have to apply for a new registration or update the existing one?
So in that case, and there's not really in that case, you would just change the name. So we definitely have had that happen. Something has gone from, I can't remember an exact example, but say Concordia College to Concordia University. We don't have Carnegie classifications or anything like that. We have our list of organizations types just said this is an educational institution. But if the name of the organization is changing, it would just go from Concordia College to Concordia University. You would submit a request. We would instantly approve that. We would verify it from online sources that yes, that is the correct name of this institution now, and then publish it in the next release. Now, one thing that I have not gotten into is that we do have a quite complicated set of relationships and statuses for when things like mergers happen. So I showed you that we have child relationships, we have parent relationships, and we have lateral relationships. We also have predecessor and successor relationships. And then we also have statuses for ROR records, which is active, which is an active record. Most records in ROR are active records. Inactive, so that's when an organization shuts down. And then withdrawn, which is essentially for mistaken records. So say that an organization gets acquired by another organization and merges into a new entity. We have ways of representing these two organizations used to be separate organizations. They have both now shut down and merged into this new entity, which gets a new ROR, but it very much depends on the situation. If it's just like you've gone from a college to a university, that would probably just be a name change, so you would keep the same ROR record. But we also, I should say, we link all those, right? So in that case of the merger, that's represented in relationships and statuses. So we did quite a work on representing that carefully.
Okay, great, thank you. And it looks like we're in our last minute here, so I think it might be time to wrap up. So I'll say thanks so much to Amanda and Kyle for taking the time to speak with us today, and thank you to our attendees for your engagement with your questions and comments. I'd like to remind our viewers that we did record today's program, so be on the lookout for a follow-up email from Choice with a link to the recording and where to access today's slides. Also, if you have a few minutes after the presentation to fill out a brief survey, we would really appreciate it. So thanks again to all of you out there for joining us. We hope you found the session informative and hope to see you again soon on another webinar.
Thanks, everyone. And thank you again, Sabrina and Ashley, for organizing.
Thank you. Thanks so much.
Bye. Thank you.